Welcome to the second part of my PhD story. It doesn't get better than in the first part, but if you haven't seen the first part, maybe go watch it before we continue. So at the end of the second year, I was working as hard as I could. I was on the 1-year contract, which means I had some flexibility and I was not constantly worried about getting fired and let go from the university from one day to the next, as had been the case for all the previous months. So the work was going seemingly well. I had to write a first paper for a conference, which was an interesting experience because it was my first real paper, and the co-authors are actually quite good at advising on how to write papers. But I had to write many versions. I was not sure how the co-writing process should be going, and the professor told me to put every result I had in that paper. That brought massive anxiety because from what I was reading online and from what I had heard from professors during my studies at the other university, you're not supposed to reprint the exact same dataset several times in papers. Once a dataset has been printed in a paper, it's printed, and you're supposed to make a new one if you want to publish in another document. As it happens in my group, data was reused in several documents, and I could see it because they were showing the papers on the walls, so it seemed to be okay for the university, but I was kind of worried it would be a problem for me. And I was worried that once I would want to publish this data in a good journal with an impact factor, like a proper scientific publication, that they would tell me I already printed everything, and so I had nothing left for this new paper. I decided as an alternative to have two sets of data. So they use almost exactly the same methodology, the processing is very similar, but it's two independent sets of data, so the results are a bit different. I figured if I was going to get attacked by the university or the professor, because that could happen in the future, then at least technically I would have two separate data sets. On a personal level, it was nice to produce these two data sets because I could make sure the results I was getting were not some exception. If the observations are the same in both samples in each case, I could assume that in general I was seeing common behavior or nothing special. Eventually, this data was turned into a better paper, a really good paper that also took months to produce because we couldn't write the paper by starting with an hypothesis and planning the figures and the reasoning. The way the internet recommends you proceed to make a good paper, so I was left following the decisions of the professor, and the professor changed his mind a lot. So one day he would tell me to suppress some results from the thesis, and then a month later he would come back and say, "Why did you suppress it? You need to put it back." And every time I had to rechange everything. And it sounds like nothing, but when you have a model on analysis and you slightly change some part of the process, it also slightly changes the whole analysis, all the numbers that you measure. So maybe the first time you had a difference of 10% and the next time you had a difference of 8%. Eventually I made mistakes. My numbers were not consistent and it was very difficult, and I got reprimand because I should only deliver papers without mistakes, but I delivered so many of them. I would never have had time to deliver the papers in time for the professor's demand and do a full checking of the document each time. It was just not humanly doable. But the paper was eventually published and grows in large part thanks to my co-authors who helped me bring the argument together, ground it, who had more expertise. So my problem is that when I was making an assertion in the paper, I didn't know if it was correct or not, and I didn't have time to do a full background check with simulation to verify. So it was very helpful to have experts say, "No, that's how it works. Don't worry about that." But I was still a bit worried about some aspects of the paper because I was not so comfortable trusting an authority figure about science, because of my experience within the university and because it seemed like all the professors there pretty much agree that anything goes as long as the professor is okay with it. So the paper eventually happened. At the end of the third year, I was put on a 4-month contract to bridge the gap between the 3-month and the 6-month contract, and then everybody in the lab would get a 6-month extension to finish the PhD. I did not. I got a 3-month extension, and which put extra pressure on me because, if you're half fired, you never know where things are gonna go, and I couldn't set a date for the defense, and the thesis was not finished. So I figured that I had to finish doing the work that was planned in the research plan. The research plan, if you remember, the boss told me what to put in, and I just put it in, and I don't know really why it was useful, but I put it in. However, I know that when you want to defend, if your professor says no, the university can force you to do all the work that is in your research plan. So it's a great strategy for the professor because he can wait until the defense and then he forces you to do this part of the research and you don't get paid. So you work for free from the university. Like, it's not even a 1 month contract, it's just no contract and you have to work if you want your title, and they would accuse me of having badly managed my time. So I did this research. At this point, I was really good with the simulation. So I had 250,000 particles, really nice samples, sending waves. I was managing my averaging, doing analysis, like the level was really good. I was quite proud of my results. They looked nice. What I was lacking is someone to do the analysis with, because it was not that helpful. So I had like a bit of feedback left and right. I had the opinion of the professor that I had to respect so I wouldn't get fired. But it was a bit lacking in direction. I eventually burnt down from the stress, from everything. So I couldn't sleep anymore. I had no energy. I couldn't do sport. Like, walking was exhausting. Taking the train was too tiring for me. And I went to the doctor and she put me on sick leaves. I was at the end of the 3-month contract. I was really worried the professor would take the sick leaves badly and decide to let me go. The doctor said he's not allowed to do that, but it's a university. And when I came back from my sick leave, the doctor put me on a 50%. I came back on the 50% and I got an email from the professor who said, the thesis should be finished by now, it's not okay. And I felt so bad. I felt so bad because I hadn't realized I was supposed to work during my sick leave. I couldn't have. I was still so tired, I could barely think. It was very hard for me to think and I kept making bad decisions. I would have to write down all the information because my memory was trashed. And at that point, I said, okay, I need help. And I went to talk to a guy at the university who turned out to be absolutely adorable. And he had been helping build a case in another lab. I had heard about him and I had just thought, okay, I try. So I came to his office with I think I had 7 work contracts at the time, and I just started crying in his office. I was so terrified. He told me, if there is a problem in your group, you need to build a case. But the university will not investigate, they need people to come and talk. So I went to people in my group and I actually told them I want to bring a complaint against the group, I don't think it's normal. And a few people joined me, and supported by this professor who is an amazing guy, absolutely awesome. And we started kind of bringing testimonies. And I also reached out to people, to former members of the lab who also had horror stories, a lot of repeating patterns of behavior because, of course, like, the guy is predictable in some way, but also personalized touch. And this actually helped me quite a lot because for the first time I had fellow humans and fellow scientists who knew what I was going through and agreed it was bad. And just having other people who could relate to the experience and who could tell me, no, that's crap, even though we were going through, everybody was going to a bit of a different situation and living things differently. Several things happened in January. I came back from my sick leave, I got the email saying I should be finished with the thesis, and then the professor gave me a meeting and he made me abandon all the work I had done for the past 6 months, sending waves through large samples, and he made me start working on some other model in the lab where I would have to send waves in this model. And I was told by the member of the lab, the goal was to verify this sample and make them more trustworthy. So in short, it was not helping my thesis at all. I was discarding really good data to work on a kind of crappy sample. However, the other positive point is that the professor let me set a date for the defense. And you probably don't know that, but one of the strategies if you want to really screw over your PhD students is to just never set a date. And at the university, I know at least one person for whom that happened. The professor just refused to set a date, and the university was basically saying like, hey, why did you displease your professor? He's allowed to do that, we can do nothing. So you reach the conclusion of your work, you have written your thesis, you have done the work, and you cannot defend it. So this date kind of became my deadline. In my head, I was like, okay, whatever happens in the next 5 months, I just go with it, I write the document, I submit it to defend. So I started working on this other sample from the group. I did as many simulations as I could, I brought it really up to speed. My colleagues were complaining that I was hoarding the superclusters because I used all my skill to maximize my use of the cluster to the maximum and to just play with the limit, so I could do as many simulations as I could to get the best possible results. So it's true, I was hoarding the cluster, I completely admit it. The thing is, I found a problem in the model, and when I tried to remove the problem, all the features I was observing were gone. And in my book, that's a wrong simulation. That's not a little wrong or a little bad simulation. That's just plain wrong. And I did not want that in my thesis. First, I didn't care about the work in the first place. Second, it did not make my thesis any better. It was completely unrelated. And the work was done so rapidly, I was not sure what type of analysis I could do. And the argument that I was given for making this work is that it would make the guy who did the work look better. Which is to say it was not helping my work or my thesis at all. But the professor was pushing for it, so I just kept making results. He would give comments. I was like, I don't care, just implement them, making the highest quality data I could. It was noisy, so apparently to make sure there would not be too many questions about the noise, I had to zoom in. Apparently you zooming on features to kind of accidentally drop out the problems. It was not the most nerve-wracking because I didn't care anymore. But the more I was studying the data, the more my belief grew that it was wrong and that I should not be presenting it to people. And in particular, I did not want to have it in my thesis. You hear these stories about these people who lose a PhD years later on because of plagiarism or scientific misconduct. And I didn't want to be 20 years later faced with people I respect and having to swear that my research is okay when I knew at the time it was not. That was really scary. And because I was getting out of the sick leave, I was not having the best thinking. Like my memory was still pretty bad. I work with Post-it the whole day long. I would just write down stuff on Post-its because it was not written, I was forgetting it. As the anxiety grew about it, I finally had I finally woke up with the realization that I would not have these results in my final thesis. Like that was my hard line. And I decided I would go and keep working until the end. So I would go with the flow and fight until the end to get my doctor title, but these results would not be in the published document at the end. And this was a sort of relief, because I knew I could make the data as good as possible, I could write the document. Once I had decided for myself that I would kick it out sometimes, I figured after the defense I would just publicly announce that I did not trust this data or find the bug and ask for the data to be removed from the thesis. Now you think it might go well because the thesis was approaching, but actually as the deadline of submission approached, the professor became a bit strange. And in pattern of the professor, when the professor is a bit strange, you know he's gonna make you fail at something so he can punish you in some way. What happened is he had scheduled Monday and Tuesday to review my thesis, and on Friday he told me and one of the postdocs that the postdoc should review my thesis and give his comment. And he also gave me a bunch of more simulations to do. So I sent my updated thesis to him and to the postdoc, and I spent my entire weekend working on these simulations. The postdoc sent me his comments chapter by chapter, which was pretty nice. It was mostly grammar stuff and making myself sound way fancier than I am. But I didn't have time to look over them. And I also completely forgot. The professor was supposed to review on Monday and Tuesday because I was so tired. I was just doing the essential, and stupidly for myself, I lowered my guard and I did not plan for the professor to screw me over at that moment. I did not see it coming. So the Wednesday after this scheduled time had passed, he contacted me and said I hadn't given him the up-to-date thesis, and so therefore I could not submit my thesis and we had to postpone the defense. He had time Monday and Tuesday to tell me, right? But he told me it's not his job to, if we make mistakes, it's not his job to correct them. And I was also mad because technically he had the most up-to-date thesis, because I sent him to him on Friday and had made no changes to the commenters that I got in between. So he had a document, he could have reviewed it, or at least checked the chapter content or the structure of the chapters, because apparently you can only get feedback on the structures of your chapters once you have written the whole thesis. It's a very useful thing from the university, especially when you don't have time to do all the work that is assigned to you. I told him, okay, we can postpone the defense, because he wanted to postpone it by just 2 weeks. But I will only do that if we have a new date, because I didn't want to be in the situation of these other guys who never had a defense date. And the professor wanted to postpone the defense by 2 weeks, and it would have made the defense in July. And traditionally, there is no PhD defenses in July and August because professors are doing other stuff. So I asked the professor, when are you available in July? And I had to insist. And when he answered, he told me he was gone for the first 2 weeks of July, but then he would be available or something like that. And the reason he was gone is because he was at a conference, except when I looked online, the conference was when he was available. At this point, I realized that if I contacted the experts to set a new date, the professor would find a reason why we could not agree on a date and why I would have to defend in September. And at the same meeting, he also told me he would prolong me by one more 1-month contract, but it would be the last. And this is mean because I still had almost 2 months to go until my defense, so the 1-month contract would not cover the time until my defense where I would be working full-time for him, and if I postpone even more, it would be more months of free work for him. So, I mean, it was a very well executed plan to screw me over by making me fail on several aspects and then punish me and then getting his way to make me work for free much longer, potentially indefinitely. I was crushed, honestly, and I spent the weekend reading the law of the university, and that's when I realized I didn't actually need his signature to submit the thesis. It's not in the law of the university. It is a law in many universities across the world. It's a law in France, but it's actually not the law at the university where I was. So on Monday, I wrote to him an email saying, look, I think I can make it to the deadline. I will submit. I would like your help with the manuscript. And I was like, we can find ways you can review just part of it or, go for the main points because that's the most useful anyway. At this point, he calls me for a meeting, and the meeting had a secretary and one of the guy in it. And that's typically meetings he uses to pressure you into doing stuff you would not want to do. Like making you quit or like firing you or things like that. He comes and he had a document written, like hastily written on a sheet of paper he wanted me to sign. And the document said I was agreeing to resign my last 1-month contract because the professor told me, like, you refuse to obey my instruction to postpone the defense, therefore you cannot get paid. You cannot have it both ways. And I told him I would not sign the document. I wanted 12 hours to think about it. The professor got really pissed and he told me that it was over and then he would no longer work with me. So essentially our work relation was over. It was stressful, but actually, so I had received the contract of the weekend and I had sent it. I had posted it on Sunday, so it was on the way, and then it was a 1-month contract was to take effect the next morning. And I went with it and I submitted the thesis. I was relieved I submitted the thesis because I figured I would at least get a real scientific feedback on the content. And if it was not good enough, it would be fine, but at least I would have a real feedback with real opinion on whether my work was sufficient to graduate and get a doctorate or not. And in the university, what happened is that if your thesis is not good enough, they don't let you do the defense. But I had to wait like 4 or 5 weeks to know if I could defend, so I was really scared. It was a bit odd because every time I would tell someone I was scared, they would tell me, no, don't worry, the professor is backing you, but actually not. The university was quite surprised because apparently no one at the university knew you could do that. So no one expected it to happen. My 1-month contract went off. I was unpaid during the month of June where I defended, and I was quite scared to go to the defense. I contacted the head of the department, who was actually very kind, and I said I need someone to be in the defense because I want it to go well. I was really scared something twisted would happen at the defense. He sat just behind the professor during the whole defense. He was not very attentive to what I was saying, but he made sure everything went well. I got the defense. I passed. It was a relief, and then we came out. It was very awkward. The way the professor interacted, then they left. I had a small apéro with my lab members, and then I went to eat with my family and with one of my best friends. At the defense, the professor told me I would have revisions and I would be paid for 2 months to do them. That was odd, and I actually did not believe it because, I figured he was telling it to me to look good to the university, but you cannot trust a professor. After the beginning of the month of July, when the contract for July and August arrived, I was quite surprised to get it and quite pleased. But I also got something called mandatory changes. So I didn't get revisions. I didn't get minor or major revisions. I got mandatory changes. And it was a long list of bullet points, anonymous bullet points, that were not consistent between them, because I think it was I think it was a list of comments from the different experts that the professor had put in a list. I don't know if he had edited stuff or not, but I couldn't know who made the comment, I didn't know who to ask, and the professor was not really suggesting much help. He told me I had to highlight in yellow every changes I made to the thesis, but some of the comments made me restructure entire chapters. So I rewrote about half of the thesis. In the end, the thesis was half yellow, which made yellowing completely useless. One of the experts was quite mad at this, which I can understand, it's very annoying, but on the other hand, I have no idea how you should do a revision properly. But at that moment, I didn't know how you were supposed to do a revision properly, because clearly you could not follow the advice on Stack Overflow. He was quite mad. He also asked me to clarify the thesis of my thesis, and as I clarified it, one of the experts commented that that's not a real thesis argument. Which again was difficult because I completely agree with him, but that's how it is at the university, and I had to defend my work, so I kind of played stupid and let it along, and the experts, through his anonymous comments, did not seem so happy, and I was feeling for him because I agreed. I also removed the chapter with the bad simulations, and for some reasons, they didn't protest. And after this update, at the end of the 2-month contract, actually things started to get bad because I was hoping to graduate, but for that I needed feedback from the professor, and he was not giving the feedback. A few days before the deadline, one of the experts sent me a series of weirdly aggressive emails that I tried to answer in the most professional manner I could, and then I stopped answering because I didn't know what to do. My dad told me that's not good, stop answering after 2 answers. And then the expert quit 2 days before the PhD conference. He didn't give me a chance to explain myself. He didn't call me. We didn't have the opportunity to talk or anything. He quit. I have no idea why. What I know is that quitting 2 days before a deadline is typical behavior of the professor of the lab, where he makes you fail or he brings a problem very shortly before a deadline, so you have no chance of making it. So that deadline passed. I asked the head of the department for a mediation in an email that's polite, but I had such trouble concentrating, and I was under so much anxiety every time I had to go back to this document because it felt completely endless, that I accidentally sent the email in 4:40. It was not the best thing I did. We had a weird mediation because he basically agreed with the professor on everything. So it made some stuff progress, but all of the key problems I had were still there. And I was really stressed about it. At this point, my parents were like, okay, you need a break. You need to get off. So I dropped it and I went on holiday for a month. And when I came back, the university had found a new expert who had reviewed my thesis, gave comments, but I did not know which. And we were still waiting for the professor to answer. Shortly before the next PhD conference where I could graduate, I pressured the head of the department to try to get the professor to conclude my thesis. And so he went to him, he tried to suggest that maybe since he hadn't answered, then things were okay and I could graduate. And so the professor quit being my supervisor a few days before the PhD conference. And he also filed a PDF to make me quit my PhD. I did writing to the rector. I might read the email because it's not my finest writing. And she answers that she had taken a look at my thesis and it seemed good that I would graduate, but she couldn't tell me more. And the crazy thing is, this email from the rector is the very first time that someone employed by the university, who I could somewhat trust, took a look at my work and gave me a feedback to my face. It seems crazy that the first feedback to my face of someone from the university would be 6 months after my defense. And I started a new job, lovely colleagues. And I kind of gave up hope of finishing the thesis. After New Year and some probing, I found out that the professor had unquit, and so he was still my thesis supervisor, so I still had a thesis supervisor. He had given me more work to do, which was really mad out, because it was basically the same point as before, but ever slightly reformulated, which meant he hadn't even looked at the previous point. A guy helped me make a nice answer that he never considered. And I figured I would never get the thesis because the next PhD conference would happen. It was over 6 months since I defended, 8 or 9 months. And then something happened. Actually, 2 things happened. The first one is the university changed president. And I think that helped because they picked a guy who'd handled the several cases that had been happening in the university. And the second thing that happened is that I don't know who went to the Tagesanzeiger and talked about the group. And we made front page of the newspaper. I discovered it was one of my colleagues came in the morning, at 7:30, and who was like, "Hey, is it your group?" Yes, it's my group. But that was nice because for the first time it was really public that what happened in the university was crap, and because everybody at the university, like almost everybody at the university, had been downplaying everything that happened to us, having it written in big black letters was cool. A few days later, I got a message saying that the professor in question would no longer be my supervisor. They had asked the new expert, and he had accepted to be my thesis supervisor. He was abroad, so it took a few months for me to print the thesis, get him to print that, but I eventually graduated in July, so 13 months after I defended, with a different professor. It was a huge relief, but I was really feeling over it. When I got the doctor title in my mailbox, I was just standing there with this fancy paper and be like, okay, it's a bit odd. In a sense, it felt like all the events that's supposed to celebrate your doctorate and be the university thanking you were kind of robbed from me. Because they happened in such an odd way, and always delayed, and always with fear and anxiety. So that's how my PhD went. It turns out I didn't do a PhD, I did a doctorate of science, but I use the word PhD because we believed we were doing a PhD for most of the thesis, and it's just easier to use that word. I want to talk about the organizational, the structural side of the university and how it happened that the case could take so long, because I think that's what's of value. If you're a person who is being bullied or mobbed at the moment, hearing horrible stories about people being traumatized is mostly going to increase your anxiety, but it's not going to be helpful so much. And I actually learned a lot about professionalism, about how the academia works, and I want to share it in the following videos. If you are still here, thank you so much for watching.